should we
The
put?
solutions are simple. I mean, speaking to people at Brave1, this idea of closing the skies over Ukraine, um, there are various people, including military people, who say, well, this comes with high strategic risk.
I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking today with one of the most respected experts and analysts in this field. His podcasts, Silicon Curtain, Silicon Wafers, and Silicon Bytes, are among the most listened to worldwide. He is extremely well connected, and it's always a pleasure to hear him and his distinguished guests. I warmly recommend to subscribe to Jonathan's channels if not already done so. My name is Christoph Müller. I'm a musician, caricaturist, and the initiator of the huge international music project We Play for Ukraine. Welcome to the channel, Jonathan.
It's absolute delight to be back on your channel, Christoph.
You just came from the Brave1 Conference, and it has just taken place in Lviv. And your YouTube channel, Silicon Curtain, is one of the media partners of this event.
Absolutely. Huge privilege to be invited to do that. And then at the last minute, they asked if I would actually chair one of the discussion panels, a sort of 25-minute. I was able to grill an absolute expert in the field of what's called cognitive warfare. So, yeah, not only was I able to be there and see it, but actually, felt like I had a real purpose in taking part.
You have interviewed a lot of interesting and important people. And what were your impressions there?
So the impressions were, I mean, it's good at these events because you get to sort of, I don't necessarily cue up the interest in advance. I just sort of meet extraordinary people and say, okay, let's record something. I wouldn't have known a few days prior to that who I was going to meet and what I was going to be talking about. So I love the sort of thrill of creating content and the energy of something that happens spontaneously. A couple were sort of planned. One has just gone on the channel with Simon Woodywis, and he is a British sort of military consultant who's based in Kiev and has been for the last 3 years. What comments we got against that is absolutely fascinating because there's many regular watchers of the channel, and many said that this is the rawest, most honest conversation because often when you speak to experts, there's a kind of, I won't say a softening, but you know what I mean? There's this way of talking analytically. There's a way of not providing the sort of texture and detail of what's going on. And sometimes it has to be said, the leading experts either may not be aware of some of the negatives or real issues on the ground, or they may gloss over those because they're looking at a big strategic picture. My friend Simon will give you that strategic picture, but also give you the raw detail about what's not working, what's failing, what needs to be fixed. And I think it's that primary experience which is just invaluable. And the audience knows we're there on the ground with someone who is really plugged into what's going on. And I think those kind of conversations are the best ones for me and for the long-term viewers of the channel.
Mm-hmm. But what kind of outcome from this conference is there now for the overall view on?
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of tech there. This is actually a pretty big event. It took us more than an hour to go through security and actually get into the venue. That tells you how many people were there. A lot of people from the armed forces of Ukraine were there to both contribute, their experience, but also to get ideas and learn. So that was fascinating. And there were many, many, many dozens of exhibitors. Now, drones dominated the sort of technical things, but you also had various, electronic warfare systems. You had or so-called autonomous vehicles, the whole ecosystem with them. It reminded me a little bit of, when you read about the early years of the car and the development of the motor car, and there were thousands of brands and factories and innovators working in garages here and there, producing a sort of extraordinary variety of shapes and types and different technologies. This is what we're seeing here. We're seeing an entire ecosystem explode. Now, someone describes it, you go to a Western arms show and everything is branded, everything's glitzy, you have a little freebies and whatever, you have the big stands. You didn't have that here. This is described as an exhibition of ugly things that just happen to work. And the products feel quite raw. Quite a lot of them feel like they are not quite prototypes, but they're works in progress. One, I think that tells us about what Ukraine is doing and achieving. It doesn't wait to perfect technologies. It doesn't wait to brand it up and make it look beautiful so it can be re-exported. It needs to develop technologies that can go immediately into the field to destroy Russians. That's what it's all about. It's about being effective, not all the kind of invented stuff around it. And the other thing it's telling us is that, and this is where I think, Western arms procurement is going to have a little bit of a problem, or has a problem that it needs to learn quickly from. These products are out of date very quickly, or components are out of date very quickly. So if you package it up as a single product and you black box it and you don't allow the software and the hardware to be kind of hacked and iterated even in the field, not even in the factory or en route, but in the field, then this thing's going to be redundant. And if you can't tinker with it, it's useless. It ends up in the scrap heap. So what you have in Ukraine is a series of equipment and systems where certain components can be swapped out where needed. If there's an evolution on the battlefield, as there is, then you can say, okay, this thing, it's not going to work, but if we do this, this, and this to it, if we add this component to it, then it's going to be effective once more. And you have to do that iteration almost on the fly. It's been said that the cycle of iteration between a product that works and one that doesn't is 2 to 6 weeks. 2 to 6 weeks on the battlefield.
That's very
Now, if we think of Western procurement cycles, you might put your idea forward. 6 months later, you're asked to tender, you win the tender. You could be in a process that lasts for many, many months, if not many years, before a product is actually built at scale. If we do this with modern drone warfare, we will lose very, very quickly because that stuff will be scrap before it's even hit the production lines. So yes, Ukraine is building ugly products that work, but it also is reflective of a new process. Now, I think people are also struggling with words to describe it. Is it a series of products? It's definitely not that, because it needs to be far more adaptable. Is it an ecosystem? Yes, it is. Is it a process and a mindset rather than a procurement function? Yes, it is that as well. One manufacturer there said that we need to think of drones as a service, not as a product, because the software and hardware need to interact in such a way, and they need to be swapped out and innovated in such a way that is highly fluid and highly malleable, which these traditional development processes aren't. So this is a real view into not just what Ukraine is doing, but the future of war. This is the ugly kind of bleeding edge of the future of warfare.
Wow, yeah. I wonder how many German representatives of industry or politicians, media have you seen there on this tech Brave One?
Interesting. I obviously this isn't representative. This is purely anecdotal. I'm trying to think. So I met a couple of Americans, certainly, and there are a lot of Americans very active there. They tend to be the more, absolutely pro-Ukraine ones, rather than just, oh, I'm from the defense industry coming here to take a look and, I'm politically neutral. No, all the Americans I met there are deeply committed to Ukraine and have some connection to it. For those people who've come from from their governments or their countries who are, I would say, certainly pro-Ukraine, but they're coming from more of a well, we've come out as part of an official, government program or whatever. We're going to report back to a certain ministry and process. Well, there were Danes, certainly. There are a couple of Swedes. There are a lot of Norwegians. Interesting, because Norway shares a border with Russia, of course. I think the Norwegians are rather, aware of what needs to be done. And that's interesting because this is my first time I really spoke to a bunch of Norwegians in this context. There are, of course, a lot of Brits, that's as you'd expect. The British are in presence, heavy presence in Ukraine in a variety of capacities. Not giving away any secrets there, but the Brits are extremely involved. The rest is interesting because, there's a whole bunch of people from different nationalities, but they tended to be people who perhaps live there or have Ukrainian partners, or they've served in the armed forces of Ukraine and the Foreign Legion. So lots and lots of people, but they're no longer representative of which country is kind of involved. So I'd say you're talking about the Nordics and Baltics, really kind of engaged there. I think there were a couple of Germans there. I saw a couple of Germans on the roll or the list of guests. I had some reference there, but certainly from my anecdotal sort of experience, it's Nordics, Baltics, and Brits which tend to dominate. Probably there's a few Dutch there as well. We know the Dutch are always very adventurous,
Hmm.
but yeah, that's the impression. And I say lots of Americans, but then many of them will have been engaged with the topic of Ukraine for a number of years, if not going back to. I mean, one gentleman was present at the Orange Revolution who I was speaking to. So these are people who are really, I say, committed to Ukraine.
Yes, this fits into the image I have. The German society, the German public, the German media, they still try, and the politicians, of course, they try to push it away. This problem, it's not our problem. This is Ukraine. There's war, yeah, we know, but let's not escalate. So this is
Yes.
always the overall feeling
We
in
have our
Germany.
own problems, Germany first, maybe kind of attitude.
Yes, and it will take a long while still to wake them up, and those drone attacks now of the Russians on Poland recently and Romania, and now the MiG-31 overflights over Estonia. They are kind of really hard push of the Russians now to make us react, but we still don't want to. So
Now make us right. Now, this is interesting because that is the framing I've seen from quite a few people involved in NATO. And actually, there's a few people who are from the Baltics I've seen who've expressed that.
uh
Do they want to make us react, or are they confirming for themselves the idea that we will not react? This is the alternative, and
yeah,
that's the one I put my money on. They're just testing the limits of it, and they're doing it based on the assumption that we won't react. And there's a very well-known analyst who I won't say who's framed it in the way you did there to say they flew the jets into Estonia to try and provoke us into a hostile act. That's not my reading at all. If they thought we were going to be hostile to those jets, I would say they wouldn't send them in.
no.
Why would they send them in if they knew they were going to be shot down? They sent them in because they knew precisely that they would not be shot down. That's mine. They want to humiliate the West. They want to show the West that's divided. They want to create further division. And my theory here is they want to show that NATO is no longer effective and no longer exists as an effective deterrent. That I think is the purpose of it, not provoking us into reaction. But this is dividing Russia. Watch. That's not to say, aha, Christoph got it wrong. It's many of the long-term experts who say they understand Russia inside out are completely divided and conflicted on this point. And I think this is where the Russians have got us on the run. If this was the Cold War, if those jets pushed into NATO territory in the way they had done, they would have been shot down in the Cold War. There's no question. And they've buzzed and tested us continuously throughout the Cold War and indeed afterwards. We know that their jets are continuously buzzing UK airspace and UK territorial waters. This doesn't even get reported. It happens continuously. Almost a week go, not a week goes by without that happening, and that's not even the context of the Ukrainian war. They've done it continuously. We send jets up, we push them out. Sometimes they try it on a bit. They know they're going to get a response. They know what the response is, but they continually test to see whether that response is still there and is weakening or strengthening. It's different in Europe and the Baltics because they are not being met and have not historically been met by that same sort of immediate, say, military action that they would be in UK territorial waters. So they're really pushing it. And I think this is also part of a pattern. It's not simply testing us. They are building up to what I think is a direct confrontation with NATO. They want to show that NATO doesn't exist anymore. And I think they will continue to escalate until they've proven that case. Right up to the point of, again in Germany, I'm going to throw this back to you. Poland is next to Germany, but it might also seem quite a long way away if you look at the sort of eastern border. What would happen if the same thing occurred over Germany? 20, 30, 40 drones dropping onto German cities. Because that, for me, is where this is probably heading.
You know, my assumption here is that the Germans will absolutely not react. If there would not be Ukraine in between and Poland, then the Russians would just walk right in here into Germany and just take us over. Maybe change the government. There's a lot of other guys who are rising now in their popularity among the voters, but this is really ridiculous. I cannot believe why. I recently had a talk with Luke Harding, and he said that you in England, you are really aware of the danger of Russian, and then you have also this guy Nigel Farage, and he is absolutely pro-Russian, but he didn't mention it with a word because he would know this will cost him votes.
Correct.
In Germany,
yes.
If you say you are pro-Russian, then you get even more voters from some parts of Germany, from the East German societies mainly, but also a lot of Western Germans are there, completely polluted. I cannot understand this. I try to work against
extraordinary.
It's
absolutely extraordinary.
This is absolutely crazy, and it's just this is so much coming into this. It's all about information. It's all about information because you.
What do they call it? Stockholm syndrome, where you fall in love with the person that's kidnapped you, and it has a ring of that, doesn't it?
It has a lot of that, absolutely. So this is crazy, and we have to point on it, and we have to get the media as long as they still exist, because also the pro. Russian, the AfD and the Wagenknecht party, and many of those, they want to destroy our public media, our German BBC. You know, ARD and ZDF is the public media. They want to defund them, and they say, yeah, we paid so much money for those, and they do only crap. So it's a lot of war going on under the surface here in Germany. Information.
And I think people will say, well, public media, you know, and they'll bring their partisan political issues to it. But actually what public media does is it creates the impression that actually there is common space. There's common space and there's commonality for people to agree on, even if they have other political differences. And actually that seems to me, when you go to Ukraine, that's what you get out of it. You know, there are people across the spectrum. There are people who I've actually never met somebody who voted for Zelensky, which is kind of interesting. And that's not, I'm not creating a sort of, conspiracy idea here. It's simply that in Western Ukraine, fewer people would have voted for him than perhaps Kiev in the East. And the sort of people I'm meeting with, which are sort of higher literary circles, would tend to have not to. But they will say, yes, but, you know, he's done this and I really like this, and he's done that and I don't like that. And they seem to be able to have I won't call it dispassionate, but they seem to be able to have a rational conversation about it, picking the good and the bad and accepting and saying that, well, Zelensky's probably the best person for the times. And I think that's to have that sort of idea of commonality, to be able to step back and talk rationally, whether you're on the left or the right, the center, whatever, however you define yourself. To be able to have that sort of common dialogue is critical. And that's not to say that everybody can, but I think we're starting to lose that. And public broadcasters create that central space. They can also create the delusion of stability, which some would say the BBC is doing at the moment by not addressing Farage, not addressing the extreme issues. There's a danger that national broadcasters can normalize the situation in extreme times. But also I think they can also create trust and commonality, which is being eroded intentionally by political extremism, and is being eroded by social media as well. The algorithm is built really for division and divisiveness and to erode commonality and trust. And that's partly why we're living through the times we are. I mean, social media has played a huge role, I think, in taking us down what is clearly a sort of global authoritarian slide.
Yeah, so we have to attack also from the public side on those on the social media, and to ban them. I have been talking recently to a French, and we have to unite also in Europe to the European Union has to bring some measures, which is very difficult because the European Union and Ursula von der Leyen, they don't have the power to tell the governments what to do, but they have the money. So
that's it. And there's a degree of normalization sort of going on there as well. Even Kaya Kallas, who I have huge admiration for, some of her language has got a little too, I would say, consensus driven since she, got appointed to the higher position within the.
Jonathan, I have another question, which is, we are seeing that the Russians have really problems with their energy sector because the Ukrainians, they are hitting successfully the refineries and the transport systems and the pipelines. And so they got more and more economic problems also. And it's really a big problem. And even the pro-Russian bloggers, they openly state now, like Ribar, I thought, I'm not sure, they state where the problems are and that it's really not well for Putin and for the government, as I see.
They do. But also we have to remember that these are tolerated. As soon as they say things that the government finds destructive or too challenging to their power, these people fall out of windows and all the rest of it. So we have to take this not as opposition in a Western sense, because it's not. They're all part of the same system. And as it was pointed out to me, I interviewed one of the leading Russian, I guess you call it dissident voices, over the weekend, a guy called Mark Fagin. He was the lawyer for Pussy Riot. And I asked this question, whether, criticism or he said criticism is the wrong word, but statements by Russian central bankers and economists at the recent St. Petersburg Forum painted a very bleak picture. And of course, if you were to look at those comments rationally, you'd say, well, the war is to blame, and the only way to stop it would be, this economic collapse in some way, would be to stop the war and try to agree with the West to pay reparations to Ukraine and make your peace. So that's the logical interpretation of their critique of the current economic circumstances. But of course, it has to be noted that none of these economists, point out that the war is to blame.
Okay.
They do give a diagnostic, and sometimes a very harsh diagnostic, of the problems and the economic outcome. But none of them will also then leap to the conclusion that you have to stop the war. So the elephant in the room isn't mentioned because they simply cannot mention it. They themselves would not last long in this world, let alone in their jobs, if they were to make that connection or directly criticize Putin. And what this Fagin said, he said that I don't understand. If I interpret that as criticism of the regime, if I interpret that as criticism of Putin, or even criticism of the war, then I don't understand the system. The system in Russia does allow certain signals and indicators or certain diagnosis of a problem to be expressed by those professionals whose job it is. But they also know the limits of what's allowed there, and they cannot draw certain conclusions, and they cannot point the fingers, especially at leadership. So he was saying, look, they will not be in trouble for this because it is their job to point out some of the reality of the economic situation and to implement measures to counter it, to allow the war to carry on by trying to sort of tweak the economic system as far as they can. They're simply pointing out that they're running out of tools, they're running out of road with which to fulfill their jobs. But it's not opposition and it's not a critique. And I think we fall into that trap of trying to interpret politics in Russia in a Western template, and it doesn't work.
Okay. I didn't want to point on this thing what you just mentioned also so much about the criticism inside Russia, but I wanted to point onto another thing also, that the reality of the economic situation in Russia is really, really bad. It's getting really bad. And so
it is.
And
but again, the conclusion would be: will Russians protest? Will there be a coup. Because again, if we look at that, when we say it's bad, in the Western framework, there are certain things that lead from that. There are certain conclusions that lead from that, which is that people, elites, will, express discontent and want change. No, the only impact of this is, will it stop Putin executing his war or not? I don't think there are any other considerations. The population have no voice to protest whatsoever. Yeah.
100% absolutely agree. And what my conclusion here would be, and I want to ask you this. Always when Putin has some real problems, and he is standing with the back on the wall, then he escalates when there is no other way out.
Exactly. Always. He accelerates into every problem. Exactly.
Yes. I'm glad that you say that. And this would mean is the danger of what kind of escalation is left for Putin now? Yeah. You mentioned it in the beginning of our interview already. NATO.
Yes, but this is an interesting one because we're going to put on an episode on my channel where we carry on and proceed further from this point of thought. So what you have a bunch of NATO experts who have a vested interest in saying that NATO is strong and NATO is still real and we're all jolly partners together and it's incredibly effective, and that is a sort of let's say a sort of corporate delusion that they are living under, which isn't to say there is still a huge amount of skill and there's a huge amount of material within individual NATO members. And I'm speaking to military people and say, look, we should not underestimate that we do have a lot of military capacity and we have very advanced equipment and so on. I think this is a political problem. NATO's become politically a zombie institution. Which means that it must be questioned as to whether it would act in a unified and effective way if placed under more pressure. This is what Russia is doing. It's trying to find out what the breaking point is and how far it can push, not to provoke NATO, because I don't believe myself that's the point of it, but it's to try and eventually show that NATO is no longer effective, and indeed to push it to a point where it becomes institutionally ineffective when it's absolutely clear that the member states will not react to what Russia does. And they are on an escalation path that is testing that. And Putin will not stop, as you said. He's on an escalation trajectory. It's accelerating. We had just a few weeks ago, the main US investment in Ukraine was bombed, a factory in the far west of the country. No reaction.
No reaction.
The offices of the European Union, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the British Council were bombed. No reaction. We had some very fine words and thoughts and prayers, but we had no reaction whatsoever. Yeah. Now we have the drones. That happened a week ago. Strong measures are still being discussed, and NATO is patting itself on the back for a jolly good, firm response to that. We did good, boys and girls, well done. That's not the point as to whether people in Brussels or Berlin or even London think they did a good job. The key here is whether Moscow is deterred, whether Moscow thinks it was an adequate response. And I have to say that Moscow is looking at this and it is reading only weakness. If we're still discussing strong measures a week later, that means they are already ineffective because they are dissociated from what's just happened. If you were to take a child and they'd done something terrible, and then you have to tell them off, 48 hours later for the thing they'd done, it has no meaningful impact, right? Because they're like, well, we've all moved on. And
that's the mechanism. Yes, I'm a teacher. I perfectly understand this.
You know that one. You have to immediately point out what they've done wrong, and you have to place a cost on that. Yeah. We haven't done that, therefore we lost. We lost that escalation. So where does it go next? My belief is there are several ways it could go. I think the next one is to challenge Germany, which is Germany, which is doing extraordinary things to help Ukraine, but at the same time has certain political fissures and weaknesses. So we could easily see drones over Germany because logistically they can reach that distance. I think the other test would be that you mentioned that Ukraine is inflicting real pain on Russia's oil sector. And it's also let's not forget, inflicted real pain on Russia's aviation sector by buzzing airports with drones. Not necessarily, trying to shoot, planes out of the sky. That's not what Ukraine's doing. It's not trying to hit civilians, but it's trying to shut down the civilian aviation infrastructure in Russia and inconvenience the locals. And various figures are put around of,
We just had
tens of millions of dollars were lost by the economy. Well, flip that. Flip that. What if Russia did the same to European airspace, shut down European civilian airspace with mass drone incursions at scale and on a continual frequency basis, not with the aim of killing anybody, but it could incur hundreds of millions of euros in damages. That would almost certainly be accompanied by an informational operation which tries to reach Europeans to say, is your support for Ukraine really worth it? You're now suffering. You're now losing money. Your pensions are worth less. Your shares are worth less. You're going to get a pay cut. You might not be able to afford to do this or that in your lives, and you're going to pay higher taxes. Is it all worth it to support, a country that, let's face it, is full of Nazis? Etc., etc. So what we'll see, I think, is some kind of physical disruptive process unleashed by Russia, which may be on aviation, it may be on our energy infrastructure, it may be sabotage, etc., but it will be combined with a massive informational operation to try to divide and destabilize our populations. It will try to incite fear, such as that if all this is going on, well, we shouldn't really be sending these weapons to Ukraine. We should be keeping them for ourselves.
Yes.
That's the other purpose behind it as well. Fear, division, distrust. And Russia will want to make us poorer and more divided. And that, I'm afraid, is where we're going in the next weeks and months.
It's not a good outlook you're pointing out here, and but I'm afraid you are completely right. And the last question would be, what solutions should we do? Should we
The solutions are simple. I mean, speaking to people at Brave1, this idea of closing the skies over Ukraine, there are various people, including military people, who say, well, this comes with high strategic risk. So probably closing the sky is not the immediate thing to do. But I think what we need to start thinking of is of Ukrainian airspace and European airspace not being distinct and different, but we need to think of them as one singular airspace with the same sort of defense imperative, with the same infrastructure. And indeed, Poland has just started collaborating with Ukraine on combined air defense and training Ukraine. So that's the first response, using Ukraine's skill and knowledge to help protect European skies, and then develop a coordinated strategic single space concept. Now, that doesn't need to involve necessarily Europeans and Brits, having dogfights with MiGs over the skies. We can still, under that umbrella concept, give Ukraine what it needs to defend its skies, give it more, and create this more unified concept. So that if stuff does come over the Ukraine border into Europe, we hit it immediately and shoot it out of the sky. We don't let it return into Ukraine. So this becomes a single strategic airspace. What we can and should also do, and this is where we come back to Germany, if there is a threat, as we know there is, of Russia scaling up its drone production and then mass drone incursions into Europe, well, the logical thing isn't just to shoot them out of the sky, but to take out the production plants. This is where Taurus comes in. We need to give Ukraine the long range capabilities to take out the factories that produce the drones, the logistics routes that supply the components, the energy that makes it happen. That's got to be the next step. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean NATO attacks Russia. We can give Ukraine all the tools it needs to do the job. They're perfectly skilled and willing to do it. And indeed, when they had HIMARS at scale, they were doing that. Two things happened then. One, the flow of HIMARS and the consistency of supply from the US went down, but also Russia has been able to innovate, and now HIMARS is far less effective because of electronic warfare blocking and various other tactics. So we need to make sure that Ukraine has the long-range capabilities, iterates and innovates them so that they are accurate and reliable, and it continuously can take out Russia's capability, military capability at source. It can no longer be about sort of sticking our heads in the sand or this concept of containment. We need to enable Ukraine to actively disrupt and destroy Russia's ability to wage war. We need to take out its war machine remotely at distance without necessarily, declaring direct war. We use a form of hybrid war against them. And that's we're going to have to embrace that and then be prepared for an assault on our media environment, our political environment, from their psychological, cognitive warfare. And we need to fight that, including the elements within our own societies which are paid and funded by Russia to undermine our own systems. We can no longer tolerate these agents of chaos in our own ranks.
Absolutely. Let me just show you this little meme which exactly explains that. This is drones have been spotted over Berlin. Those are the agents of Russia. They have not only those. There
are many more.
There are many more, and we have to get rid of them. Another thing is really to you mentioned in the beginning NATO is almost dead, or it's a zombie. We have to establish a new thing together with Ukraine. You mentioned it with Poland starts accelerating the collaboration. So we have to establish a new defense system, and with Ukraine on the top, because they are really the best and the most experienced and the most skilled. I still cannot understand why we keep them apart instead of completely embracing them and incorporating them into a common European defense alliance. This would be very necessary from my point of view.
Again, I think it's Russian propaganda here. If we think of Russia and Ukraine as really being, brothers that have fallen out or coming from the same place or being similar, then we get them completely and utterly wrong. Ukraine is a European country that has been under an assault for several centuries, and it's in process of de-Russifying itself. It is not a kind of sort of Russia thing that is slowly becoming more European. We have to think of it the other way around. Absolutely. They are European. They're an absolutely integral part of European culture and European geography. And until we start thinking it that way, we will continue to fall into the mental trap that Russia has created for us.
Jonathan, thank you so much for this really very interesting talk, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Definitely. Keep up the good work.
All the best to you. Bye-bye.